Hey friends, welcome to a new edition of Math That Matters. We're going to do the logic unit. We're going to start this and it's going to be amazing. I think you're going to love it. I think you're going to find it super useful. You may at first not think that it's actually math, but it is. And I thought to start things off, I would give you a clip from my favorite cartoon, Megamind. So let me share my screen and you will see where all things logic come from.
Sir, please, it's for your own good.
But what do you know?
I may not know much, but I do know this. The bad guy doesn't get the girl.
Maybe I don't want to be the bad guy anymore. You heard me? Who are you? Now give me the keys.
No! My sole purpose in life is to look after you.
Well, I don't need you to look after me.
What are you saying? You don't need me?
Let me make it clear. Code, I don't need you.
You know what? You know what? Code, I'll just pack my thing and go.
Code, fine.
Code, find back. Well, good luck on your date.
I will.
That doesn't even make any sense.
I know.
It's the best. Good luck on your date. I will. That doesn't even make any sense. Greatest line ever. Let's see. Here it is. The dialogue between Minion and Megamind. Good luck on your date. I will. That doesn't even make any sense. I know. The question is, why doesn't that make any sense? How come it's funny in the movie, and how come when we look at the dialogue, we say to ourselves, that doesn't make any sense? And I think the obvious thing is the question, there isn't a question. Good luck on your date. If he would have said something like, have fun on your date, then he could say, I will. But good luck on your date does not get followed with, I will, right? So there's just something inside of us that knows what was said completely doesn't answer the question at all and doesn't even make any sense. And that's why it's funny in the show. But the question too is, why does it make any sense? And we're going to learn about the rules for sense making starting in this video. As I just mentioned, this might not seem like math at all to you. So what we're going to do is we're going to take words and we're going to examine them. We're going to look at the structures of the words, and we're going to look at particular logic words within those words that connect the words in a way that either does or doesn't make sense. But we're going to go beyond what you normally do, because constantly in real life, you're deciding if something makes sense, and actually you're trying to make sense out of your words. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But what we're going to learn how to do is to take those words and turn them into symbols and test those symbol structures against the rules of logic to see if it really does make sense or if it really doesn't make sense. And then once we test the words, we'll re-put them back together, and maybe it'll be in a revised form, or maybe we'll have to just revive what we were saying and thinking and articulating all together, because something else makes sense. But we're going to learn to understand what makes sense and then to compose and create sensible thought and argumentation. It's going to be amazing. You're going to love it. I'm going to love it too. Warning though, with great power comes great responsibility. The Bible says in Proverbs, life and death are on the tongue. Words matter. Words have power. The tongue is a small part of the body, but makes great boasts. A great forest is set on fire by a small spark, and the tongue is a fire, a world of evil. It corrupts the whole person and sets the whole course of the person's life on fire. And it itself, the tongue, is set on fire by hell. Animals, birds, reptiles, creatures of the sea, all of them are being tamed and have been tamed by man, but man cannot tame his own tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who've been made in his likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. This, my brothers, should not be. This, my sisters, should not be. So with great power comes great responsibility. We will be teaching you some things that will give you more power. And with that power, you have the opportunity to do good, or to do evil. And that is a scary thing. In addition to that, though, if you learn to think logically and put your thoughts together with the right heart, it will give you the ability to love well. And of course, that is the greatest commandment, to love God and to love others. And how do we love? There are lots of ways to love, but one of the ways that we love is by putting words together in a way that elevates, in a way that serves, in a way that considers, in a way that expresses generosity and humility. So if you learn to arrange and articulate your thoughts toward people and toward good, this can be amazing. We want to construct persuasive word arrangements from good ideas, because an idea is just an idea, but we can build something off of that foundation. We want to convince people with words that what is true is worth believing in. It is worth practicing. What is true, who is true, is worth following. And words can protect from that which is evil and destructive. So I'm going to give you a power. I'm going to give you a force. And we want to use it for good and not evil. Because the dark side of the force is very real and very destructive. We know logic can be used to manipulate. It can be used to hurt. It can be used to tear down. This is a matter of asking God to sensitize our heart toward the power of words and logic, so that we don't use it for selfish purposes, which can be very, very painful. God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but a spirit of power, a spirit of love, and a spirit of self-control. So we want to use this power in a loving way that is self-controlled, that we might be gentle. Gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit. It means power under control. So we want to use these words with gentleness, and as Timothy says, respect, so that we can give a reason for the hope that we have. Also in Corinthians, though, we read this: we demolish arguments. How do you demolish an argument? It sounds very violent. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Sometimes the arguments that we need to demolish are the ones that come into our own head. Maybe they're even the ones that we think against ourselves. You know, have you ever had those self-destructive thoughts, and you have to take them to Christ and you have to think through why those things are lies, even though they can be so convincing and so compelling, so destructive in your own head. And so we need to learn how to take those things apart so that we can believe and exercise and express and be the image bearers of truth that we are. To use the force for love, speaking the truth in love, to grow, to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. So that's what we're trying to do with this. We're trying to learn how to use this force, this tool that God has given us called logic, for love, and to build up, not to tear down. I love mathematics because really I think the goal of all mathematics is to pursue truth. And truth with a capital T is Jesus. I mean, Jesus said, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So truth is Jesus. Truth is life. If you continue in my word, he said to those who had believed, you are truly my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So there's great freedom in the truth. And I'll just make a short little scriptural argument here. Logic is freedom, or it leads to freedom at least. Here it is. In the beginning was the Word. This is John 1. The Greek word for word, the name that God gives himself in this is logos. In the beginning was the rational one. In the beginning was the sense. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So God is giving himself this name, logos. And later it says in John 1, the Word became flesh That's what the incarnation means. The God in the flesh. Jesus is God incarnate. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's Jesus. The Word is God. The Word became flesh. Jesus is God. Jesus, the Logos, is the truth. And Jesus just said in the previous slide, you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free. So logic, the Logos, is the path to true freedom. And that's exciting. So you're going to get a lot out of this, not just more skill, but I think you're going to find great freedom if we understand logic and we tie it back into the very nature and character of God. I will say this too, that there's like capital L Logos, there's capital T truth, there's capital F freedom. and those are referring to God. They're referring to Jesus. They're referring to eternal life. But then you can see in red here, there is logic, the system. There's lowercase l and there's lowercase t truth. And I would just say that lowercase t truth is what is, right? It's accurately understanding reality. That would just be truth. And truth with a capital T is referring directly to Jesus. And I think there is a natural connection between the two, though Jesus, the truth, is greater than truth, just the small definition, what is the accuracy of being. But I will say that all truth is God's truth. And what is matters. And what is will lead to freedom. So when there is falsity, when there is deception, when there is lies, those are the things that we need to demolish because they are setting up, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. So when something isn't true, when something is inaccurate, it at least indirectly is setting itself up against the knowledge of God because all truth is God's truth. And we do have a deceiver, the prince of this world, the Bible says, that lies, that destroys, that seeks to steal and devour, the accuser. And we need the weapons that God has given us against the accuser. We need the scriptures and we need the Spirit and we need the Logos. We need to be able to take those and understand how to wield them, the sword of the Spirit, as it says in Ephesians 6. But the Greek word for sword in Ephesians 6 is the small sword, the sword to be used with precision. So if we just take the scriptures and we don't have the Spirit and we don't have the Logos and we wield them irresponsibly, then we can be using this force for darkness, not light. All right, so let's get into some of these details. What is an argument? As you learned in our video, an argument really isn't a fight. An argument is something else. In fact, we're partnering with the Civility Project at George Fox, and two of the virtues and values of the Civility Project are thoughtfulness and charity. Thoughtfulness, we want to be thoughtful in two ways. We want to think well and be thoughtful in that way, but we also want to be thoughtful or good-hearted toward those who might seem to be our opponents. Our opponent is really Satan. Our opponent is not another person that we disagree with, so we want to be thoughtful toward them. And charity is the principle of representing the best argument that our, quote, opponent has in its best form. So our goal isn't to win the argument. Our goal is to find the truth. So here's a particular way of thinking and interaction that is not what we're all about. So Sally, in this case, this is from our textbook, our Logic and Critical Thinking textbook. It's section 1.1. They have these little short sections that I'm going to do several of in each video. So Sally says abortion is morally wrong, and those who think otherwise are seeking to justify murder. Bob says abortion is not morally wrong. Those who think so are right-wing bigots who are seeking to impose their narrow-minded views on all the rest of us. And I'll say our hope in this section is to do neither what Sally did nor what Bob did, because those are just assertions. Those are just attacks. We're looking for arguments, and that doesn't mean there isn't disagreement. That doesn't mean that it doesn't require courage. That doesn't even mean that there isn't defense. I mean, think about how many people were offended by Jesus. But it does mean that our goal is to put words together in a thoughtful way that is seeking to convince, not just attack. So how could an argument like this be made? A well-constructed progression of thought made up of statements called premises that connect to each other logically and route the thinker to the end, which is the conclusion. Sally could have said this: abortion is morally wrong because, which is a logic word, you're going to see some of these in a chart in a few minutes, because it is wrong to take the life of an innocent human being, and a fetus is an innocent human being. That is an argument. Now, sometimes it comes out in sentences or paragraphs, and sometimes we just need to reorder them. Ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to put these arguments into symbols so we can completely take out the subject that is being discussed, and we just represent with symbols, and we can test the symbolic representations with the rules of logic and see if it's a valid argument or not. So, but the interim step is to take an argument like what's in yellow right there. Oh, something happened. I think what happened is there it is. Went too far. This could have looked like, oh my goodness. There it is, yeah. I'm probably not gonna edit this video, so you're gonna get a few bumps in the road. That's okay. All right, Sally could have said this. We could outline her argument. Her first premise is, it is morally wrong to take the life of an innocent human being. It's a statement. The second premise is, a fetus is an innocent human being. And her conclusion is, therefore, abortion is morally wrong. This is actually a valid argument. This is thoughtful. It's well put together. Now, not everyone believes this argument, but it's a good argument. It is a valid argument. It meets the rules of the test for whether or not an argument is valid, and I'm going to teach you that. That'll come more later. Identifying arguments. The best way to identify whether an argument is present is to ask, is there a statement that someone is trying to establish as true by basing it on some other statements? If so, an argument is present. If not, there's not really an argument. But sometimes it's easier to distinguish whether or not an argument is present by looking for keywords and phrases that are called premise indicators or conclusion indicators. So here are a bunch of logic words: since, because, for, as. Given that these words over here indicate that I'm about to give a reason for some assertion that I just made. So when you see these kinds of words in a verbal argument, you might want to underline or highlight them because they're an indication that something's coming that's important. Similarly, therefore, so, so that, hence, thus, these are conclusion indicators. What that means is the thing I'm about to say logically or naturally follows the things I just said. So these are important indicators. You see the previous argument has a because in it. That's an indicator. That's saying my reasoning for the previous assertion is about to come. I'm going to tell you why. How about this one? I know the student plagiarized since, okay, something's coming to validate the statement that was just made. Since I found the exact same sentences on a website, and the website was published more than a year before the student wrote the paper. There you go. So we look for keywords. Bob the arsonist has been dead for a year. So Bob the arsonist didn't set the fire at the East Lansing Starbucks last week. That would make sense. Good argument. A poll administered by Gallup showed candidate X to be substantially behind candidate Y with only a week left. Therefore, candidate Y will probably not win the election. So we look for these words. We're going to take apart arguments so that we can test them to see if they're valid, and then we're going to put them back together, or maybe we're going to need to revise them, as said earlier. Now, sometimes these words show up and the context of the sentences that they're used in doesn't make them logic indicators at all. I have been running competitively since 1999. That's referring to something else. It's a different usage of the same word. Now, what you can do is you can go to that same kind of indicator and you look at the list of those and pick another word that is similar to that word from the same list and see if the sentence makes any sense. I've been running competitively because 1999. Makes no sense at all. So we would say since is kind of on the list, but it really in this context isn't being used as a logic indicator. How about this? I am so happy to have finally finished that class. Consequently and so are similar words, similar types of indicators. I am consequently happy to have finally finished that class. It doesn't work. Doesn't work. So you can always try using those synonyms, those replacements, to see if the words that you're reading are actually indicators or just frauds. 1.3. I'm not going to spend very much time. In fact, this is the only slide on 1.3, and I didn't assign any problems, but I just wanted to look at a clarification from 1.3. The author of our text is talking about the goal of an argument is to convince that this conclusion is true. But if there is an attempt to show why a conclusion is true, it's an explanation. So he's making the distinction between an explanation and an argument. I don't know that I really care very much about that, though it's kind of an interesting definition. But let's move on. All right, so 1.4 is called more complex argument structures. You can see these sections in the text are just kind of little short, easier bites to take of things that could be complex. And so I'll just cover, I think I'm going to cover through 1.6 in this video. Is this a good argument? Let's see, a more complex argument structure, because there's just more stuff. There's more words, there's more sentences. No one living in Pompeii could have survived the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The reason is simple. The lava was flowing too fast and there was nowhere to go to escape it in time. Therefore, this account of the eruption, which claims to have been written by an eyewitness living in Pompeii, was not actually written by an eyewitness. So I want you to think about that for a minute. Is that good? Does that make sense? What's the conclusion? The conclusion is this thing that was written, this account of the eruption, couldn't have been written by an eyewitness. Do they provide good, convincing evidence that that conclusion is valid? So you can pause the video for a second if you want to. What we like to do is we kind of like to rearrange text like this into statements that are in order to see if one follows another, which follows another, which follows another, which ends up at the conclusion. Well, you can pause it as long as you want, but I'm going to click to the next slide. To rearrange this argument, you could say first, the lava from the mountain was flowing too fast, and there was nowhere for someone living in Pompeii to go in order to escape. So it's impossible for someone to escape. Therefore, no one living in Pompeii could have survived the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which means the account of the eruption was not actually written by an eyewitness, because obviously there couldn't have been any eyewitnesses. They would have been dead. So this is actually a good argument. It's a valid argument. How about this one? And by the way, I think this is one of the hardest things to do. The hardest thing to do is to take something that's kind of all mixed up into verbiage, which is the way that language comes out. It doesn't come out in nice linear fashion. And that's, I don't know why, I'm not an English major, but we kind of mix up language in our communication sometimes. And then in logic, we have to kind of unmix it so that we can test it. But this is one of the harder things to do. And then once we unmix it, then we have to try to take those statements and put them into symbols, which will come later. So let's see, is this convincing? I know Wanda rode her bike to work today because there's a logic word. When she arrived at work, she had her right pant leg rolled up, which cyclists do in order to keep their pant legs from getting caught in the chain. By the way, I did get my favorite pair of pants caught in my bike chain a couple of years ago, and I kept them, but they ripped. So every time I wear that kind of beige pair of pants that I really like, there's a rip right down at the bottom of the leg. You'll see it now because I didn't tuck my pant legs in. Too bad I hadn't taught this class. I'd have known to do that. All right. Moreover, our coworker, Bob, who works in accounting, saw her riding toward work at 7:45 a.m. Is this a good argument? Is this convincing? Does this really lead to, do the facts lead to Wanda must have ridden her bike to work today? You could pause it, think about it, try to reorder these statements, maybe talk to a friend about it. But here's what I got. 3 premises and a conclusion. Kind of like 3 chords and a truth, but didn't somebody say that from the Beatles? Anyway, let's see. Wanda arrived at work with her right pant leg rolled up. There's some evidence. Something's going on. Why is your pant leg rolled up, Wanda? And I know cyclists often roll up their right pant leg. Why the right? Because that's the side that the gears are on, right? Bob, in addition, saw Wanda riding her bike toward work at 7:45. Is this enough evidence to say, yep, Wanda rode her bike to work today? I think it's pretty good. You can decide if it convinces you or not, but I think it's pretty good. All right, let's talk about valid arguments. How do we decide if an argument is valid? What valid means is it fits the structures required of it to be true. And that basically what that means is if the premises are true, the preceding statements from the conclusion, if they're all true, then the conclusion has to be true. Not is probably true, but has to be true. A valid argument is an argument in which if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. That is the most important statement right there. So I say to myself, not are the premises true, but if the premises are true, does the conclusion have to follow? That's the question. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So going back, it is morally wrong to take the life of an innocent human being. Premise 1. Premise 2, a fetus is an innocent human being. Conclusion, therefore abortion is morally wrong. Now, you may not believe premise 1. You may not believe premise 2. Maybe you believe them, but someone else doesn't. But this is a valid argument. A valid argument is one where if the premises are true, so given that this is true, like if you assume premise 1 is a fact, if you assume premise 2 is a fact, that forces the conclusion to also be true. This is a perfectly structured argument, which means when we try to decide if an argument is not valid, we have to either look at the structure and say the structure doesn't follow the rules. And again, you don't really know the rules yet, even though there's something in your head that kind of says, actually, this does follow the rules. Or the second way to invalidate an argument is to go for the premises and say, it may be a valid argument, but I don't believe it because I don't believe this premise, or I don't believe this premise, or I don't believe either premise. So if the premises aren't true, then we aren't even testing the argument, we're testing the premises. And it may even take a whole nother argument to validate or verify or convince someone of the premises in an argument. This slide is essentially what I just said, but here's what we do. If the argument isn't valid, it breaks the rules. The arrangement of the thoughts is not logical, it's a fallacy, it is nonsense. However, a valid argument can still be untrue or not believable because the premises may not be true. So the structure is good, but the premises are not viable. So the problem wouldn't be with the form or the structure, but it would be rather with the substance of the argument. Here we go. Is the following a valid argument? Is it true? Premise 1, everyone born in France can speak French. Premise 2, Barack Obama was born in France. Conclusion, therefore, Barack Obama can speak French. There you go. Is that argument valid or not? And again, what that means is if the premises are true, then the conclusion must follow. It has to follow. It actually is a valid argument. It's not true, but it's a valid argument because is everyone born in France? Can they speak French? And the answer is, of course not. Was Barack Obama born in France? No. But if the premises are true, the conclusion has to follow. So this right here is a valid argument, but it's not a true argument. It doesn't come to a true conclusion because the premises are false. It does behave. It follows the rules. Very interesting. How about this one? This one's actually an invalid argument. George was president of the United States. George Washington, maybe? Therefore, George was elected president of the United States. Well, George Washington was the president of the United States. Does that mean that he had to have been elected? And the answer is not necessarily. Maybe he was appointed. So what we do to try to informally see if an argument is invalid or not is we say to ourselves, supposing the premises are true, this one just has one, is there any way that I can think of, rationally speaking, is there any possible way the premises could be true, but the conclusion is not also true? That's how we sort of informally decide if an argument is valid or not. And if I can see another way or a different conclusion, then I say, I think that argument is invalid. And there it is. I have slides here, so you can always just pause the video. You can take a picture of the slides if you want to. Most of this stuff is just from our textbook. To apply the informal test of validity, ask yourself whether you can imagine a world. So this is just hypothetical. Can I imagine a world where all the premises are true and the conclusion is false? There's some other explanation because the conclusion is what has to follow from true premises. If you can imagine such a world, then the argument is invalid. If you cannot imagine such a world, the argument is valid. I think this is kind of an interesting slide. And I put it in here because if you change premises just a little bit, you can get vastly different conclusions. So some people believe, for example, that humans by nature just have something inside of them that's evil or that's bent or that's wrong or that just wants to do bad. Other people believe the opposite, that humans are good by nature, that the thing that's inside of a human is more powerfully good than evil. And if we can just get to the core, we'll get good. Whereas these people believe if we can just get to the core, we'll actually see ugliness, we'll see evil. Now, everybody probably, this is premise B. So premise 1A goes with premise B. Premise 2A goes with premise B also. But premise B, I think both sides and everyone might just agree with this. Evil in the world is rampant. There is actually evil and suffering everywhere. To deny that is to close your eyes to everything. But if you take premise A1 and B versus if you take premise A2 and B in your argument, you're going to get to vastly different conclusions. If you believe that humans are evil by nature and you see evil in the world, then you think to yourself, we need to get to the core of the humans in order to deal with this evil problem. In other words, we need to get to the evil problem by dealing with it from the inside out, from the individual out. Whereas if your premise is this second premise instead of the first, and you believe that humans are good, but you look out in the world and you see evil, then you say, boy, if we could just get to the core of the human, we would have good. So we need to fix this problem from without. We need to go outside of the humans. We need to fix the system. We need a new society. We need a new government. And if we can just reform the exterior structures, then we can support, or then what is what is beautiful and good inside the humans will not be oppressed by the structures that push it down and cause the evil. So you get completely different conclusions, basically depending on these two different premises. And I actually think that these are possibly the two most contrasting and important premises in the human condition that lead to vastly, vastly different and polarized opinions. So that's why I brought this up. A couple more checks. Are these valid arguments? Helen jumped out of an airplane without a parachute. Therefore, Helen fell to her death. Is that valid? Helen jumped out of an airplane. So in order to test this informally, I would say to myself, okay, is there a world where Helen jumps out of an airplane without a parachute where she does not fall to her death? And I think about this and I say, what if the airplane was on the ground? I think she could jump out of an airplane that's on the ground without a parachute and not fall to her death. I think that that argument is invalid. Again, the informal test to see whether an argument is valid or not is it'll be valid if you assume the premise to be true and can't find any other way than the conclusion to explain things. But it's invalid if you assume the premise is true and you look at the conclusion and you say, I think there's another way. That means invalid. How about this one? Helen jumped out of an airplane traveling 300 miles per hour at a height of 10,000 feet without a parachute. Helen fell to her death. Now, is there any way that Helen could do that and not fall to her death? Can you think of any way that this wouldn't follow this? And the answer is probably not, unless Helen is Mrs. Parr, Mrs. Robert Parr, that is, Mrs. Incredible Elastigirl. So I think maybe I just found a way to invalidate the argument. But also you have to live in cartoon world, which is well worth doing as often as possible, whether you're watching Megamind or The Incredibles or some other fantastic movie like Bug's Life. So I'm a big cartoon fan. How about this? Is this a valid argument? A person can be president of the United States only if they were born in the US. Obama was president of the US. Kenya is not in the US. Therefore, Obama was not born in Kenya. Can you imagine a scenario where these premises are true, but the conclusion is false? You can only be president if you're born in the US. Obama was president. Kenya is not in the US. Wait a second. If he would have been born in Kenya, he couldn't have become president. He must not have been. I think that's a pretty good argument, actually. Yeah, I think that's a valid argument. Again, a valid argument isn't necessarily true. It is just that when the premises are true, the conclusion must follow. It's the only explanation. How about this? A person can be president of the US only if they were born in Kenya. Obama was president of the United States. Therefore, Obama was born in Kenya. Well, that seems kind of strange. That should seem kind of strange to you. This is actually a valid argument. Now, it's not true, but assuming the premises are true, does the conclusion have to follow? And the answer is yes. Now, clearly, premise one is not true. You don't qualify to become president of the United States only if you were born in Kenya. That's ridiculous. But again, the test for validity is if the premises are true, then the conclusion must follow. And this is a valid argument. It's not true, but it's valid, which is weird. All right, I think that's about enough. I think I'll finish with one of my favorite comic strips, Calvin and Hobbes. And I think it kind of takes what we've been talking about and makes fun with it. How about that? Honey, you're missing a beautiful sunset. I'll count to 10 and then pow. Okay, so here's the narrative. Dad, how come old photographs are always black and white? Didn't they have color film back then? Sure they did. In fact, those old photographs are in color. It's just the world was black and white then. Really? Yep, the world didn't turn color until sometime in the 30s, and it was pretty grainy color for a while too. That's really weird. Well, truth is stranger than fiction. But then why are old paintings in color? What if the world was black and white? Wouldn't artists have painted it that way? Not necessarily. A lot of great artists were insane. But how could they have painted in color anyway? Wouldn't their paints have been shades of gray and black then? Of course, but they turned colors like everything else did in the 30s. So why didn't old black and white photos turn color too? Because they were color pictures of black and white, remember? The world is a complicated place, Hobbes. Whenever it seems that way, I take a nap in a tree and wait for dinner. And so with that, I think I will give you the opportunity to take a nap in a tree and wait for dinner. I'll see you in the next lecture.